spinning off of our last episode, which was talking about old mechanic.
We call them Tech Marines.
And yes, we call them. Yeah. Derail me. I see. That's how we're recording late instead of early, so I have no one to blame but myself.
You like the railguns, right?
We're 40 seconds in. I can't believe we're already this far off the rails.
Yep. It gets better, folks. I swear. Hang in here.
Does it?
Theoretically, okay. Theoretically, it will get better. Welcome to Preferred Enemies, the Warhammer 40k podcast whose big guns never tire. I'm your host, Rob.
Kevin.
Dennis.
And Richard.
And yes, we are kind of spinning off of our last episode, which was talking about old mechanics. And we're going from there and kind of taking a look at vehicles, both the history of rules for vehicles in 40k and their current iteration in 10th edition, what we like, what we don't like about them, how we deal with them, changes we would like to see made up, things like that. But first, a little bit of news. There's not a lot of news for 40k other than we're getting another preview this weekend while you guys are at the Grand Narrative in Atlanta.
Yeah, we'll probably be there to see it.
I think it drops like Friday at 1.
It's like Friday
1 p.m.
Eastern, middle of the day. Yeah, so yeah, probably between breaks. Hopefully, it'll be between rounds. Because I think they did the same thing in Dallas, didn't they? Where the preview was between like the
first and second championship rounds. Yeah. I guess they'd like that better than making it a night event.
Yeah, makes sense.
And also that allows the UK group to watch it at like 6 p.m. rather than like 2 a.m. So I imagine they're fond of that.
Yeah, I don't care about that. They can get up in the middle of the night if they want to, see it.
Nothing. But it does confirm, like the way they're announcing it, that Old World and Horus Heresy are pretty much core games at this point. Like all four, like I think Old World gets mentioned first. It's like Old World, 40k, Age of Sigmar, and Horus Heresy in that order. So they're all getting kind of equal billing.
And in a way, I'm fine with that because, as we've been saying, we want our game to not get updated every 2 years. So maybe this will help space it out more.
I love your optimism, Dennis. I wish I shared it, but I love it.
Yeah.
The only other thing of note that's been released is the battle forces went up for we talked about them a couple episodes ago. Knights, Necrons, Sisters, Tau, and Dark Angels. And we kind of talked about like how good they were to double up, what the points per set were. And of all of them, surprisingly, because we are at like 36 hours or so since they went up for pre-order, and as of time of recording, only the Dark Angels one is sold out, and apparently it's sold out relatively quickly, like in the first hour or so.
I mean, that doesn't surprise me, because I thought it was probably, besides maybe Knights, it was probably the best one if you didn't have Dark Angels, because they were all new models. The Lion looks amazing. I mean, the only downside of that box is if you already had the Lion, you don't want it.
Right.
But it's a great deal if you don't.
Well, yeah, and that's what's surprising. Like the Knights one, Knights usually, like anytime they do a bundle with Knights, it usually flies off the shelves, and it's still available for pre-order.
Only thing I can think of is maybe the saturation of Knights is done. Everyone who wants Knights has them, because I will know all of my local friends here, none of them have any interest in Knights because they don't like playing against them. So they kind of know, well, if I don't like playing against them, other people won't want to play against me. So yeah, let's focus on other things.
Yeah, and like the Knights players that I like, the people I know who play Knights, especially play Chaos Knights, they're so loaded up on War Dogs or Armiger style models, they don't need more. They've got like, they're running a dozen already or something like that. So they're good to go. So maybe we just have hit Knight saturation at this point. The Necron one, I don't think... actually, any of the others, I don't think really surprise me that much. The Necron one was interesting, but if you already wanted the Void Dragon, you likely had the Void Dragon, and you're not going to want to. The Sisters one is a niche Sisters army, and if you don't want to... Yeah, if you don't want to run Repentia and Archoflagellants, it's really not that useful to you. And the Tau one is a set with 4 models in it. The Knights one has more models. I just want to put that out there.
Oh my
god. The Knight box has 1 additional model. I'm not counting the drones. They're not playable models right now. They are tokens. So yeah, the Tau one is... And having just played a Retaliation cadre list, which I took against Chaos Knights, and that went about as well as you would imagine. It's not that it's an okay list, but it's not a take all comers list. And it's a thing.
I think what's kind of interesting is like across all of the battle forces. Like I said, the Dark Angels one is sold out. The only 2 for Sigmar that are sold out are the Iron Jaws and the Maggotkin of Nurgle. So I'm actually a little bit surprised that like all of the other ones are still available. I don't know. I wonder, like, maybe this is, a thing to discuss, whatever, but have they hit a point where there's too many big boxes like this that are coming out? Like maybe the value isn't there and that's why people aren't buying them. Like, I don't know. Like, cause I'm looking at some of these and like, there were big launch boxes for several of these factions. There's been other like big battle boxes in the past with something to get some of these groups. Like, have we just hit a point where maybe they're doing this too much?
It's possible because like the last 2, outside of the Skaven Blight set, the starter set for 4th edition Age of Sigmar, the last 2 big ones that I remember were Flesh Eater Courts and Cities of Sigmar. So it's like if you were going to buy into those armies, you probably already have a lot of this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Now, and granted, I'm saying this as somebody who has not played Age of Sigmar, but it's like I think you can, like, our local store, like Pulp Fiction still has a Flesh Eater Courts like launch box, like 3rd edition launch box on the shelf, and I think they had a Cities of Sigmar one not that long ago, like still. So while these are some different models, some of them are the models that were in those kits. So maybe we're just hitting, maybe they just picked the wrong armies, and I think the wrong armies, the wrong makeup for them, because like the Necrons one, it's like, as we discussed, like that doesn't say Satan to me. That says Monolith. Like if you're doing Hypercryptid, that should be a Monolith, but the Monolith would be most of the cost of the kit, even with a discount. Nobody's really chomping at the bit to play a Penitent Crusade host for Sisters. The Retaliation cadre is a bad choice. I would have if you were going to do this particular setup, I would replace the Ghost as good as Ghost Keels are. Don't get me wrong, Ghost Keels are good. As good as they are, I would replace it with a unit of Crisis Suits, so the commander has something to command. Yeah. So yeah, it's just a very odd choice for some of these looking back now.
So what are the odds then that GW takes the wrong lesson from this and all of the box sets next year are just Space Marines?
I mean, there's always a 50-50 chance of that.
Well, as long as one of them is the Space Wolves with Russ, I'm fine.
Yeah. Well, because like looking at it, like the thing that kind of sticks out to me is like the Space Marine one sold and the others haven't. Like maybe it is just as simple as that. Like people like Space Marines, they don't want to buy, Necrons in a big box like that. I don't know. Maybe there is like legitimately just less of an audience for some of these other factions.
And Kevin, I'm going to use the narrative as an example here. We're going in expecting that at least half of the armies in the narrative are going to be Imperium. Mm-hmm. Meaning, yeah, the Xenos and Chaos, they're interesting, but not as many people are playing them, so they probably won't buy them.
Yeah. Yeah, I just thought it was very interesting.
At the same time, though, I wouldn't be surprised if they don't go heavy on Space Marines unless the revamp that they're giving them in like a month or so is going to make a big difference in how they play, because Space Marines are not exactly tearing up the charts. A couple of varieties of them are, but like specifically non-compliant chapters. But Space Marines themselves are just kind of mid right now at best. So yeah, hard to say what's going to happen with this. I'm looking at the cost right now of buying Asterath and Lamarty separately, because those models are now available as separate instead of having to buy the Blood Angels box, which our local store still has a Blood Angels box on the shelf too, which occasionally tempts me, but I'm not going to spend $230 on it. Although if I wanted those two models, that's $90, which would get me a third of the way there. So, but yeah, so the army boxes, the holiday boxes, surprisingly didn't disappear yet. And if I remember right, last year's were gone very fast.
Yeah, if I remember correctly, yeah, they were gone almost immediately.
Yeah. Well, now I think other thing about last year's was they had a lot of models people were after. They had models that had been out of stock for a while, so I think that contributed.
Yeah.
Yeah, because let's see, the boxes last year were, the Voton one, which is where you figured out where all the Sagittars went.
Yep. Right.
Basically the World Eater's army in a box with Angron in it. The 2 Rogaldorns for the price of 1 Cadian Defense Force. The Tyranid Onslaught Swarm, which gave you one of the Norns. The Beast Snaga Stampede, which was, hey, look, we dug out all those old Beast Snaga boxes that we launched them with, and we've repackaged them for you. And the Spearhead Force for Space Marines, which was, do you like Jump Intercessors? Oh, please, God, we hope you like Jump Intercessors.
And I think that was the weakest one of them.
That was the weakest one, and still, I think they all did okay as far as sales went.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know the Jump Intercessors. There's a couple stores here that still have that.
Okay, wow. Okay.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, that surprised me. But yeah, so I don't know. It seems like maybe I'm just, looking back with rose-colored glasses, but I seem to remember in the past holiday bundles. Now, I do remember there was one year, I think it was the year before that, when they had like the 6 different Space Marine holiday bundles. Because they had like the Imperial Fist one, the Raven Guard one. Yeah, those did not sell out evenly. Because like nobody bought the Imperial Fists one. I remember that for sure.
Right, and that just, if you look at the past 2 years of history, then it's not it being Space Marines. It's, do people want the models that are in the box?
Right.
And I think 2 years ago, some yes, some no. Last year, yes, we do. This year, not really.
Okay, so I'm looking at the army boxes from 2 years ago. So there were 2 Space Marine ones. One was the Raven Guard, one was the Imperial Fist. And those 2 did not sell very well. Right. Of the other 6, one was the Sisters with Morvenval, 2 units of Paragons, Battle Sisters, and Sacrosancts. That one went pretty quickly, if I remember right. Watchers of the Gate, which was basically an entire...
I got so tempted with that one.
Yeah, an entire Custodes army in a box. The Chainbreaker Lance, which is almost identical to this year's holiday box, except you can't build Canis Rex with it. That's the only difference.
And it's funny that the Canis Rex is probably what's going to keep people away.
Yeah. They could have just brought that box back as it was and been fine. And then there were the last year we had the Angron and World Eaters box. 2 years ago we had the Magnus and Thousand Suns box and the Mortarion and Death Guard box together at the same time. And then finally a Belisarius Call and a bunch of Mechanicus stuff. That one probably struggled a bit because Mechanicus was not great at the time. And yeah, it seems like those boxes did... I seem to remember mostly doing better. Not entirely, but I am surprised that we're like a day and a half in and only one of the boxes is sold out. Granted, it is probably the one that makes... Because didn't you say it was like 1,500 points by itself? Or something like that.
Close to that, since it's all the Terminators and the line.
Right. Yeah, it's a really, really good box, so I'm not surprised that it's sold out. I'm just surprised. I guess the Knights one is the one that boggles me. But maybe you're right, Dennis. Maybe we are at Knight saturation. Which leads us to, I think, is a good segue into our main topic, which is vehicles, which Knights definitely are. That they are a subset of vehicles. And so before we get into the current state of vehicles in 10th edition, let's take a look back down memory lane. I'm only going to go back as far as 3rd edition because 2nd edition, we never played other than you and I very briefly. Dennis.
I don't think we had vehicles then. We just had little guys.
We had it. We had a lot of infantry.
There was one. We had
cardboard
dreadnought.
Yeah, baby.
Oh man, vehicles were expensive back in the day, dollar-wise, because they were all metal and huge.
Oh yeah.
So nobody had them because you didn't want them. They were heavy.
Yeah, or like at most, I had a metal dreadnought. I remember building and painting a metal dreadnought, and that's where the old dread sock joke came from, where the idea is that you could drop a dreadnought into a sock and beat someone to death with it, because it's basically a large chunk of lead.
Yeah.
But looking back through, I opened up all the rule books that I had, going from 3rd edition onward into 7th edition, and 3rd edition is what started for the kind of set the guidelines for the way vehicles were done for the vast majority of the history of this game. And that was vehicles with a completely different, they had a completely different stat line than anything else. They didn't have toughness or strength. They didn't have wounds for the longest time or anything equivalent to it. Instead, they had armor facings. And you had to divide the vehicle up into quarters so you knew which facing went with which sides of the vehicle. And you would take your weapon strength and you would roll against it. And if your weapon strength plus your roll beat the armor value, you penetrated it. If it equaled the armor value, you would glance it. And if you did neither of those, then it didn't hurt the vehicle at all. Vehicles had their own movement rules, their own close combat rules. For a while, they had rules for tank shock where you could rush infantry with a tank. And all of this was kind of set up in 3rd edition, which is an edition I think none of us played. We all got in late into 4th edition.
I actually never played 4th edition. I bought models during 4th edition, but then didn't actually get to play until 5th edition came out.
Right. And I think, Kevin, you were the very tail end of 4th.
Yeah, I think it was... Yeah, it might have been the same situation where I didn't necessarily play any games in 4th, or if I did, it was just 1 or 2. But the in retrospect, the difference between 4th and 5th edition was so minuscule that I don't remember.
Right. Well, going back in the day, when I say vehicles had their own rules, and we're not just talking about transport rules, a lot of those have been, even going into 10th edition, transport rules have been relatively similar. I think the biggest change was that they got rid of having to be near the actual exits on vehicles instead of just having a general bubble of if you're anywhere within 2 or 3 inches of the vehicle, you're fine. Back in the day, it's you actually had to care about where the access points, where all the exits are on the vehicle.
Which made open-topped vehicles really nice, because everywhere is an access point.
Everywhere is an access point. But vehicles, because they had their own rule set, they also had a lot of additional complications, like knowing how the weapons were mounted on the vehicle, because that would determine the vehicle's arc of fire, which could determine what you could shoot at with certain weapons. So like sponson weapons, so like the guns on the sides of tanks could only shoot at certain things depending on what angle the tank was at.
I mean, that kind of makes sense to me, because if I'm standing on the right-hand side of a tank, the left-hand sponson would never be able to get to me unless you, I guess, angled a bank shot that you had a rubber round that could bounce off of things. Yeah.
You can't, you mean you never like just spun your tank around 360 and no scoped somebody with the side sponson?
No.
Amateur.
Actually, if we're talking this way, I played Eldar, so I didn't have to worry about that, because anytime I played Imperium and had my Land Raider, I got hit by terrain and stuck.
Yeah, that's fair.
Also, looking back at vehicle rules, there were some things that I had forgotten about for the longest time, just because since like 8th edition, it hasn't really been a thing, and a lot of these rules even got changed after between 4th and 7th editions. Like, remember defensive weapons were a thing?
Yep.
Anything that was like strength 6 or less, and how fast you moved the vehicle could determine what and how many weapons you could fire.
Was it 6 or less? I thought it was 4 or less.
Okay, so in 4th edition, it's 6 or less. In 5th edition, it's 4 or less. So you are probably remembering 4 or less because they did downgrade it.
Right, because I remember that was a big deal for my like Wave Serpents and the Fire Prism, because I could take either a Strength 6 Shuriken Cannon or the Strength 4 Shuriken Catapult. And so I took the Strength 4, especially in the Fire Prism, so that way I could shoot the big gun and could still shoot my little Strength 4 defensive weapon.
But yeah, it's like you could, like in 4th edition, if the vehicle sat still, you could fire all your main you fire everything, or an ordnance weapon if you had ordnance. So like if you had if you were like a basilisk or something like that, it's like you can fire anything or the big gun. If you moved up to 6 inches, you could fire one main weapon, which main weapons were anything that were stronger than a defensive weapon, and all your defensive weapons. And if you moved up to between 6 and 12 inches, you couldn't fire anything unless you were a fast vehicle, which was its own thing. And mostly your Eldar ones.
Well, I'll say this, Rob. It makes me think of like this edition is one to go back to the vehicles being really strong. And here the vehicles are strong, but they had the trade-off that they weren't as big of a weapon platform as they are now, where I like the Repulsor Executioner that can fire like 30 shots.
Right. And something else that I think we also have forgotten, because we're so used to like units can split fire. In 4th edition, infantry units could not split fire. Like if a unit targeted something, they had to fire all their weapons at the one unit they targeted. That applied to vehicles as well. So not only did the weapon, like where the target was in relation to your vehicle, determine what weapons you could fire, they still all had to fire at that one thing, which meant certain weapons, like if you have a las cannon on a tank, why would I ever fire that tank at infantry? Because it's like, it's like I can't say, well, I'll fire like all the defensive, the smaller guns at the infantry, and then I'm going to fire the turret with the las cannon over there. Nope, it's all it's all or nothing at one target.
Well, and I'll say this, it speeds up the game in a way, because if I have my infantry that has a rocket launcher, well, only the rocket launcher can hurt the vehicle, because there were times when weapons just couldn't harm things.
Right.
And so I only had to fire one gun, the rocket launcher, instead of all like 10 shots. So that speeds things up.
It does. It does. There were a lot of things about vehicles that did not speed things up necessarily, like vehicles in cover, especially if determining like which armor facing, like if the armor facing is against a wall, what happens there. There were whole sections of like the 6th and 7th edition rule books that dealt with weird corner cases like that. This or a variation of it of these basic rules were what we played with for 3rd edition, again, which we didn't play with, 4th edition, 5th edition, which lasted about 3 or 4 years, 6th edition lasted 2, 7th edition lasted 3. So for about a decade, I'd say, that we played with these rules. 5th edition had its own tweaks to the system. It still had the everybody fires at, like, the vehicle all fires at one target. It did kind of simplify, like, if a vehicle moved, it was effectively the same, but they changed the wording on it. The big change to 5th edition and the edition that we all kind of played in collectively. Remember glance locking a vehicle?
Oh yeah, that's how I could beat you, which I never did.
So this gets into another thing that differentiates vehicles in past editions from basically anything 8th edition and forward. And that was vehicles, like I mentioned, the glancing and penetrating hits. Well, glancing and penetrating hits in different editions either had their own damage table, or it would change the result you could roll on a damage table. So, for example, there was one damage table in 5th edition, but if you only got a glancing hit, you got a -2, which means you could not destroy the vehicle directly with a glancing hit. So most likely what you were going to do was shake or stun the crew of the vehicle. That was a result of 1 or 2 on a d6, and it even specified if it was 1 or less, it was a shaken crew. Shaken meant the vehicle could move but not shoot. Stunned meant the vehicle could not do anything. And because that was like those were the most common results you were going to get if you hit somebody but didn't penetrate their armor, but just managed to just glance the armor. Vehicles didn't have hit points. They didn't have life, like wounds or anything like that. So it was either the vehicle was healthy, the vehicle was immobilized, or had lost a weapon, and you had to track which weapons were destroyed separately, or the vehicle was just destroyed. And sometimes you could stack, well, if it's immobilized and it gets immobilized again, it's destroyed, things like that. Or if it has no weapons left and it loses another weapon, it's destroyed. So you had kind of a wound system, sort of, which made vehicles with lots of weapons live forever.
Oh man, Primaris vehicles would have been amazing in that edition.
Oh god. The repulsor is made of gun. It will never die in an older edition. But the damage table, with a lot of weaponry and a lot of vehicles where the standard vehicle armor value, rhinos were 11 on the front, 11 on the side, 10 on the rear. So that meant weapons of strength 5, like heavy bolters, you could never penetrate the armor. You could just glance it. So you could just throw heavy bolter shots at a rhino or something on a rhino chassis and effectively lock it from ever being able to shoot for an entire game.
Yep.
That's what you kind of had to do with vehicles. And like you said, an entire unit would have to be dedicated to keep on trying to glance it. And then the opponent could target what you were targeting. And it was very strategic of, I need to kill this unit so then that way they'll stop shooting my unit. So then that way I can shoot my unit or the bigger unit. It was
right. But it's also one of those things that made anti-vehicle weaponry. And this is before we had any anti-blank, keyword or anything.
Yep.
Yeah, so basically it was anything with high strength and very low AP, because this was this system, you wanted lower AP, it was better. Things were weird then. I don't miss that aspect of it, But basically, for example, the Melt-A-Gun was a strength 8 AP 1 weapon. AP 1 was really good against infantry because it could it could penetrate any infantry armor just automatically. If you got hit by a Melt-A-Gun and you didn't have an invulnerable save, you were going to have a bad time. If you were a vehicle and you were hit by one, for one thing, strength 8 would penetrate, automatically penetrate all but or not automatically, but you had a very, very good chance to penetrate all but like a Land Raider, because Land Raiders were armor 14 all around.
Mm-hmm.
But if you did penetrate a vehicle, AP1 weapons also had a bonus to the damage roll, which meant you were far more likely to get that destroyed result, which meant, so on a 5-up for most weapons, and for a 4-up with, for like a melt-a-gun, because you got the +1, it would just destroy the vehicle. Like if you hit a vehicle with a melt-a-gun, you had a 50-50 chance of just outright destroying it. It was fantastic.
If you had Melta.
If you had Melta.
Yes.
But las cannons were also like usually AP2, which were still like, they didn't give you the bonus, but they were also stronger. So they were usually like strength 9, so they were a little bit more lightly to pen. Yeah, right. Which actually gave you kind of a nice granularity on weapon design, I think. Whereas now it's like las cannon is the gold standard for everything, and the melt-a-gun is kind of a unloved sibling at this point.
Yeah, I still haven't figured out the Melta-Place yet.
But yeah, you could basically just get your vehicle stun-locked for a good chunk of the game. Of course, there were also issues where vehicles could easily get immobilized. This is something that no one misses, really.
Yeah.
I stopped playing Land Raiders because of that.
Yeah, I think you had Land Raider, and it's usually the minute they hit a bit of difficult terrain, because on difficult terrain...
You had to roll a d6, and if you rolled a 1, they became immobilized on that terrain and stopped movement right there.
You were excellent at rolling that 1 every time.
I did it twice, and then I said, no more, I'm not using Land Raiders. Until they got rid of that rule, and I'm like, okay, I can use Land Raider again.
See, at least though your Land Raiders still had weapons so they could shoot. If you had, say, something like a Mauler Fiend or a Dreadnought that didn't have melee weapons, and it got immobilized, it just sat there.
Yeah, it just became a lump, and you had wasted points on it. So
I'm fine with you doing that, Kevin.
I did not like that.
Or the other option, just play Elder and have floating vehicles that don't have to make those checks.
Yeah, I don't want to play pointy ears.
Well, okay, play Tau, which you did.
Which, yeah, that was one nice thing. Like, skimmers just ignored that rule. Like, they would just go over terrain. It was fantastic. But yeah, so vehicles, they were strong because in older editions especially, they were hard to kill unless you had dedicated weapons that were dedicated to the cause of destroying vehicles. But they also had a lot of limitations. They couldn't necessarily bring all their guns to bear. They could get immobilized easily. You could assault one and just lock it down. Like, you could send a group of scrubs up to just beat on a vehicle and it couldn't shoot because the big guns never tire rule wasn't a thing. So
I mean, I do think, isn't that how orcs dealt with some of the vehicles they didn't like? They just sent all their boys to surround it or something?
Yes.
Because the vehicle couldn't kill all the boys.
Right. There was also always the fun of, like, surrounding a transport and destroying it, and then if, all of your dudes were around the vehicle, then, like, the enemy models couldn't get out of it.
Yeah, and they just died.
Never had that happen to me before.
I actually did that in a big tournament once. Against an open-top Tantalus.
Okay, that's funny.
And then, and orcs, you also had the benefit, like, you could, like, any squad of boys was going to have a knob with a power claw in it. That's just how it went. And the power claw could pretty much destroy a vehicle pretty easily.
Mm-hmm.
Because power claws were, like, what, AP1 or AP2?
Yeah, they were AP2, I'm pretty sure, if I recall correctly. And generally, like, strength 10, or at least strength 10 on the charge. And then they went down to, like, strength 9 or something.
Mm-hmm. This was also the period in which Thunderhammers were feared.
Strength 10 AP1, wasn't it?
Use the same rules as a Power Fist, which they doubled your strength. It was a power weapon, so it ignored armor. There was no AP with the weapons. They just straight up ignored your armor. They would double your strength, so they were strength 8, sometimes up to a strength 10. And if you hit a vehicle with it, it automatically shook the crew, no matter what damage result. Yeah. So 5th edition Thunderhammers could just stun lock a vehicle immediately. But also they were strength I mean, 8 usually at the bare minimum, and a lot of times they could go up to strength 10, and that would be enough to, like, you could crack a Land Raider with that.
Cody as a Thunderhammer was only strength 6.
Because he was only strength 3 normally?
I think so, yeah.
Yes.
But that was pre fancy pants model, so
right.
The trade-off was worth it.
Or you had chain fists where it was like a power fist, so it doubled your strength, so they were strength 8, but it rolled 2d6 for its armor pen.
That's what it was. Yeah, because chain fists had basically had the Melta rule for melee. Because I remember that, like, for my Chaos Terminators, I would always try to, like, put as many chain fists in there as I could.
Right. As far as, like, and when we talk about Melta, like, currently Melta does, like, an extra 2 damage or whatever the Melta value is if you get close enough to, like, if you're within half range. Melta weapons, basically, if you were within half range, they got the extra d6 to penetrate. So, like, Melta guns, if you got up close, now granted, they were like 12-inch range, so you had to get within Melta range. Melta range is a thing we're all very familiar with for years and years. But if you got within Melta range, unless you rolled like crap, you were penetrating that vehicle's armor. Yeah. And you were going to destroy it, most likely.
Which, I mean, makes sense. Like, that's you're fusioning a hole in the side of the tank. Like that, you know.
Right. Which is why, well, we'll get into it with 10th edition when we get there, but that was like the Melta was the gold standard for destroying vehicles. Like, if you had a tank that, like, if you played Black Templars, you always took the multi-Melta on your Land Raiders. If you could take a squad of Melta guns to, like, have in a Rhino or something that could roll up, pop out, and Melta down a vehicle, you did. Fire Dragons for Eldar, I mean, like, they were a meme for a long time. It's like, what do? I ride in a Wave Serpent, I pop out. You have 1,000 years of training. What did they give you? Melt a gun.
Yeah. Pop out of the Wave Serpent, melt down the Land Raider, die to bullets. But you've earned your points back.
Right.
Exactly. And that was so good. It became a meme. But then, when the vehicle changes happened, you don't kill the vehicles as much with a squad of Fire Dragons, so thus you don't see them on the boards really at all anymore.
Yeah.
Right. And then we get into, like, 6th and 7th edition, and this is where things started changing. Now, a lot of the rules were the same. And again, even in 7th edition, vehicles could not split fire unless they were super heavies. Like, super heavies could split fire. This is when we had, like, Knights, Bane Blades started moving from Apocalypse level games into like the core gameplay. But most vehicles, again, could only fire all their weapons at a single target. But vehicles also had a new part of their stat line. They had hull points. Hull points were just wounds for vehicles. If you got glanced or penetrated, your vehicle lost a hull point. Which meant most vehicles had, like, 3, like, your standard vehicle had 3 hull points, so you could take 3 glancing hits before you were done. And, like, that really made vehicles a lot less resilient. And I think it was a good change in those editions, because 5th edition was the edition that gave us, like, parking lots of Razorbacks, or the Leaf Blower list that was just, like, a parking lot of, like, Basilisks and other artillery for guard. Like, vehicles did get a bit got a bit out of hand in 5th edition, but mostly that was due to codexes being poorly balanced. And we got a lot of, like, flavor of the month armies, and because the release schedule was very slow, balance was very slow, things couldn't catch up to adapt to some of those armies very well.
And it wasn't flavor of the month, it was flavor of the 6 months.
Yeah. We were talking, this was a period where we would get 2 codexes a year if we were lucky.
It does really put this, like, 3-month codex drought in perspective, though, because it's like, it feels where I'm like, oh my God, there's no new stuff coming out. What do I do? And it's like, this used to just be how it normally was.
Right. 6th edition, though, also gave us an additional classification of, like, we got super heavies, which had been introduced in Apocalypse, but this is also something else that was kind of introduced in Apocalypse, really made it into the core game with 6th edition. That was flyers, which we've talked about a bit in our last episode, because flyers were just very unloved, and rightly so, addition to the game. Flyers were either the most broken thing ever or they were useless, and they've never been anywhere in between. This also, there were new categories. Chariots were a thing in 6th and 7th edition.
I didn't like them then. I still don't like them now. They could just stay in Sigmar.
At the time, it was the old world. Or fantasy, but yeah.
Fantasy, same difference to me. I have a bunch of Slaanesh chariots that I got. I tried them out. They were bad even in that edition because they were assault vehicles that couldn't shoot and had very poor armor because they were assault vehicles, and they just died most of the time before they could get into assault. And when they were in assault, well, they just didn't do that great. I'd rather have a bunch of demonettes assaulting.
But, like, by the end of 7th edition, a lot of stuff had been piled on top of vehicle rules. From, like, you look at the 3rd edition and it's pretty simple. 4th edition, a little bit more complex. 5th edition, a little bit more complex. 6th and 7th edition, a lot more complex. Because you've got flyers with hover mode and zooming. You had chariots. Made sure we had to have special rules for heavy vehicles, not to be confused with super heavy vehicles. That's a different thing.
Well, super heavy vehicles had structure points as well, and which were like super hull points, and eventually
they
too much.
They did consolidate it down to just being hull points. It's just you had a whole lot of hull points. Skimmers had their own rules. Walkers, so anything like dreadnoughts or sentinel stuff, wraith lords, stuff like that. Well, I think wraith lords still counted as monsters, which was also a confusing thing because you would have things like riptides that were monsters, but they looked like vehicles, but they were monsters, and they used monster rules and not vehicle rules. Yeah, it's like the vehicle section of the 7th edition rulebook is very complex with lots of diagrams. And I think at that point they had kind of lost the plot on vehicles. I think we kind of adjusted to it, kind of like the boiling a frog way, where it's like, yeah, we're in the middle of this, and that's just what the rules are doing and how they're changing over time. I guess we're just used to it. And that's what made 8th edition such a sudden shift away from that, where all the vehicle specific rules were stripped away. Like 8th edition, everything's a unit. Everything behaves the same way. Looking at the 8th edition core rules, they're so small. They're so very small. The only remotely specific vehicle rule in the game is for transports. Like, transports are the only thing that even seems to matter about a vehicle. Like, there's no big guns never tire. There's no special rules for ramming with vehicles or armor facings are gone. Everything's using strength and toughness and armor saves and wounds.
That armor facing was gone was the weirdest change. And I think the biggest strength thing for vehicles, because as we said, they normally had to like shoot based on where they're turned and facing, and you defended your tanks by having them face the opponents because your front armor was always going to be your strongest. And with that gone, it made vehicles seem stronger because, well, there's no more armor facing. They're just as tough as their front armor used to be, and they can shoot anything.
Yeah.
It was scary.
Although, again, toughness did cap out at 8 for the longest time, other than like Titans. Like Reaver Titans were like T9. Warlords were like T10 or something like that. Like, even Knights in this edition, in 8th edition, capped out at toughness 8. Land Raiders were toughness 8. It just like they had really good armor, they'd have a lot of wounds, and this also was the edition where, yes, if a unit has multiple weapons, it can split fire, and so tanks became ridiculous gun platforms. Strange enough, also the edition where Primaris got all their tanks, so Like, one might think there's a connection there.
Probably not. I can't see it.
But I will say, like, 8th edition, the rules were so much simpler. Like, vehicles, I don't think felt... They were still good. They didn't feel different. It was just like, they were tougher. Like, that was about the main thing about them, is they were harder to wound.
They were a really tough unit that normally had high cost of points.
Right. Because they didn't... And other than being transports... Or maybe your heavy gun platforms. Like, if you're a guard player, you need tanks because that's where your strong guns are. But, like, vehicles in 8th edition were pretty bereft of special rules. I mean, like, I'm looking through... Oh, let's see. Let's pick a faction.
Orcs.
Let's see. A battle wagon. Toughness 7, 16 wounds, 4-up save... Doesn't have an invulnerable save. It can have an extra toughness if you give it an Ard case. And this was the edition where instead of having to track whether a vehicle is immobilized, because nothing could be immobilized anymore, and rather than having to track if a vehicle lost weapons, because we're not doing that anymore, instead you just tracked the remaining wounds, which could affect, in this case, the movement, the strength of its melee attacks, and the number of melee attacks it had. And that was as far as the vehicle could degrade. And monsters used the same kind of pattern. And otherwise, it's, it has the vehicle keyword, but that's the keyword was the only thing that made it really a vehicle, other than just being a pile of tough wounds.
And how it looked.
And how it looked on the table. But like from a rules standpoint, it wasn't anything particularly unique or special. It just it was tough and it had a lot of guns. And they were still cool, don't get me wrong. There were some really neat vehicles. But the rule system is even simpler than what we have now. It wasn't until 9th edition when we started getting some things brought back specifically for vehicles, like aircraft rules got put into the core system again. Big guns never tire, so that you couldn't lock a monster or a vehicle down by just like charging it with a bunch of scrubs.
I do think that was a Knights issue, because most other lists, you would balance between your infantry and your vehicles. Knights couldn't because they didn't have infantry.
Right.
And I think that's the only reason why we got big guns never tire.
And that's that right there. That is the extent of rules, again, except for like aircraft rules in 9th edition in their core rules and the transport rules. Like, though, again, transports have been like, there's been tweaks and adjustments on like, can you charge after disembarking? Like, what happens if you disembark before the transport moves? What happens if you disembark after the transport moves? We've had variations on that rules for the last 7 editions, but that was pretty standard. But yeah, 9th edition vehicles were a little bit more complex, still pretty common. I think 9th edition is also when we get rid of the like, if you have this many wounds, these stats go down, these stats go down. 9th edition, I believe, is the edition that gave us you would just have multiple stat lines for a vehicle depending on how many wounds it had remaining. Which I don't know it's basically the same thing as 8th edition, just spelled out a bit more clearly. So it's not until 10th edition that we got the damaged section where it's just like, oh, okay, once you're down to like, usually around like a third to a quarter of wounds remaining, now you have a penalty to hit and maybe you lose some objective control.
And it's kind of still the same, but it feels less bookkeepy and also less impactful. Well, I guess maybe it is still impactful, but once they have to be really low for it to kick in on a lot of vehicles.
Right.
And it's like they're just one shot away from dead. I don't know. And I will say, just like the other vehicle degradation charts, this gets forgot about at times too. Since it's just one thing, it's easier to remember, but I can see it get forgotten just because it's an upgrade that happens during the game. And that's, I don't know.
Yeah, it's so okay, so that's but anyway, this like kind of is the journey of how we got from the very like what eventually became the very complex vehicle rules of up to 7th edition to the rules we have now. The other big change that happened with 10th edition, and when it was first announced, we kind of lauded it as a neat idea, and that was the idea that toughness was no longer going to be capped at 8. And we saw a little bit of that in 9th edition at the very tail end. If I remember right, the Chaos Space Marine Land Raider was T9. And that was huge. Like, all of a sudden, it's like, wait a minute, they can do that? They can make them toughness 9? And it was like what we didn't realize at the time was it was a hint of things to come. And now vehicles range anywhere from like toughness 6 for the very, very light ones all the way up to like T12, and like Titans get into like toughness 13 or more, which has led to some very interesting things as far as the weapons that you have to deal with vehicles, because again, like the idea of penetrating a fixed armor value and getting on a damage chart, that is not a thing anymore. Vehicles are just buckets of wounds with an armor save and a toughness. But because that toughness has scaled up, so for example, like rhinos are T9, like slightly heavier tanks are going to be like T10, like predators, whirlwinds, things like that are T10. Land raiders are toughness 12. Suddenly, though, that makes the weapons where, like a meltagun, for example, used to be very good at cracking open anything. Like a rhino, they like you get within melta range, you would roll 2d6 to penetrate the armor of the rhino, so you were almost guaranteed. It was hard not to roll 4 or better on 2 dice. And instead, you have a vehicle, or you have a weapon that is ostensibly designed to crack a vehicle, but only wounds it on a 5. And at best will do a little bit of extra damage. If you only manage to wound with like 1 meltagun, you can't kill a rhino. You won't do enough, like, even if it's like Melta 2, you won't do enough damage to kill it if it's not taking any other damage.
Well, and that part I'll say has been there since they added like the hull points. There was always a chance that you didn't do enough damage with your guns to one-shot vehicles anymore.
Well, yes and no, because penetrating hits would do a hull point and get you a roll on the damage chart, which with melting...
once they got rid of the whole damage chart thing as well.
Yeah, once the damage chart went away, yeah, starting in 8th edition, that became a thing. But correct. At least back then, a meltagun was still like strength. Like it wasn't as strong as it used to be, but at least it was toughness, strength 8 to a toughness 8. So you still had like a 50-50 chance to wound. But yeah, at that point, they stopped feeling like they started feeling less strong against vehicles. They were just guns that did a little bit more damage. Whereas, like, if we compare that to like the 8th edition, let's say 8th edition Space Marines with, unfortunately, this was back when you could actually have just a list of weapons in the back of the codex instead of having everything being bespoke for individual units, which you can argue whether or not that's a win or a loss. But like, let's see, a las cannon was strength 9, so it was better at wounding T8 vehicles, but it was AP 3 and D6 damage, as opposed to a meltagun, which was strength 8 but AP 4, so it was more likely to get past armor. It might even just deny you an armor save. D6 damage, but if you were close enough, you got a chance to roll higher on the damage. Didn't give you bonus damage, it just meant you rolled 2 and took the highest. Still not great. Like, meltaguns have been kind of bad compared to their older iterations for a while, but it feels like in this edition, the strength of the vehicles went up, but the strength of the weaponry did not in many cases. In a few cases it did, because like las cannons are like strength 12 in many cases?
Yeah.
Yeah, they're strength 12, but the Melt-A-Gun is still strength 8. So that's a balance issue that needs to be addressed.
Like maybe if it was...
Or strength 9.
10.
They're strength 9. Yeah, or they're strength... Melt-A-Guns, I think, are a lot of them strength 9, but 9's still not enough. Yeah, strength 10, and that's one of the things I found with the Bringers of Flame Sisters detachment is that extra point of strength from being within 12 inches makes a huge difference.
Yes.
And we've talked about how like monsters and vehicles are like harmonized now. They were harmonized in 8th edition. They're still harmonized now. But because we've got anti as a keyword, like one of the suggestions for Melt-A-Guns has been like, well, make Melt-A-Guns anti-vehicle 4-up. Well, would you also want to make them anti-monster 4-up? Because otherwise, yeah, you'd almost have to.
Because I'm playing Votann a lot, and I have grav guns that are anti-vehicle. I play against a lot of Tyranids. Know what the anti-vehicle does against them?
Nothing.
You're right. So I would love for them to treat monster and vehicle the same. I mean, I get it for at least grav, because grav is you're making the metal shake apart more. So I could see that, but Melta should burn everything the same, unless you're the Avatar. Except they got rid of that.
Like weapons don't have, like, they do have keywords, but it's not the same. Of course, that was also always weird. Like, well, these are the weapons that are considered Melta weapons, and these are the weapons that are considered Flamer weapons. Oh, we added a new codex. Okay, we'll have to errata that to add them to the list of what could be a Melta or a Flamer weapon. So, yeah, vehicles now they're in an interesting spot, but I don't think they've been properly balanced. Like, as far as like the whole ecosystem of the game, where there's still a little bit of haves and have-nots, you can work around it. But as we've talked about this for the edition for a while now, the fact that like not all anti-vehicle weaponry is distributed evenly.
Well, even not all vehicles are distributed evenly, because like Space Marines, I don't know how many vehicles they have, but it's a lot. But there's only a few you'll want to take, because why would I take one that has just one gun when I could take one for a few more points that has like 12 guns? Or, I mean, the only difference is transport capacity. And even then, I think Land Raider is probably still the most balanced, because you get trade-offs of, do I want the Flamer version or the Melta version or the Lascannon version? So that one feels like it's the same, but each of those has a trade-off. But like the Gladiator or the Repulsor and the Repulsor Executioner just wins hands down.
Oh yeah, I mean the Executioner has absolutely like horrific it's not anti-vehicle, but it might as well be.
Oh, I had to include it in my army to take down the Tyranid monsters. And I don't feel sorry for that. In fact, the Tyranid players were telling me, you need to get a big gun on a big tank to hurt us. I'm like, okay.
Let's see. It is the Heavy Laser Destroyer. Yeah, strength 16, AP -4. So it's got Melta AP, strength 16, which will which will wound just about anything on a 3, if not a 2, and 2 shots and D6 +4 damage each. Yeah, that will destroy, like, one round of shooting will destroy a lot of vehicles, let alone monsters.
Yep. As long as they don't have invuln saves.
Yeah, as long as they don't have invuln saves. Yeah, it's like that kind of firepower. A lot of armies just can't mount something like that. They just don't have that option. Or they have it, but it's inferior in some way or other, because that Repulsor Executioner is also hitting on 3s with 2 shots. And it's heavy, so if the vehicle parks, it's hitting on 2s.
Yeah, but I'm just even comparing it to like the Gladiator, where I've got a strength 10 that has 2 shots. Yay.
Or you compare it you compare that to the Tau Codex, and the classic anti-vehicle weapon for the Tau was the railgun. The railgun was terrifying because it should be. If we look at an old Tau Codex, the railgun was a strength 10 weapon, which was ridiculous for the time.
When the highest toughness is 8.
Yeah. Well, not this is armor. We're talking about this is like 4th edition, so we're talking armor penetration. So it could still penetrate. It could glance a Land Raider
on 2s.
over it glanced a Land Raider on 4s, but it could still penetrate a Land Raider on 5s or 6s. Yes, Land Raiders were 14.
Oh, well, I don't know why I thought they were 12, or that now they're 12. Never mind.
But rhinos were Razorbacks. They were 11 in the front and side. So don't roll a 1 and you penetrate the armor, and it was AP1, so it would add to the damage result. So a railgun would just make a vehicle, point at a vehicle, it is likely going to disappear. It was that kind of terrifying, or it was going to immobilize, at the very least immobilize, or just destroy a weapon on it or something. Railguns were terrifying. Now the railgun, on a hammerhead, because it's the only thing that could mount a railgun at that time, broadsides could as well. But the hammerhead now, yes, it is strength 20, which is scary. Do not get me wrong. It is AP -5. You do not get a save from it unless you have an invuln, or if I roll a 6, in which case it's devastating wounds. It's D6 plus 6 damage, which is not enough to kill another hammerhead, because a hammerhead has 14 wounds, but I also only get 1 shot a turn. Consistently, the Gladiator or the Repulsor Executioner is a better weapon, is a better gun platform than a hammerhead.
I was going to say, and I'll flip over to the Votann with the Land Fortress, which it's the middle of that, where it's got strength 14, AP -4. I mean, I've got 2d3 plus 6 shots. I mean, I'm looking at their last codex right here, because that's what I had to compare. So it's I hit as hard as an Executioner for strength, so the railgun still wins, but that 1 shot is painful if you only get 1 shot on a weapon.
Mm-hmm. Now, hammerheads do have some things that can mitigate that. If they're attacking a monster or vehicle, they reroll 1 to hit. If they are, they can reroll 1 hit or wound roll whenever they're selected to shoot, which can really help guarantee that wound is gonna wound.
Yeah, but it's still, that double shots means you can do twice as much damage.
Yeah,
and neither the railgun does not do twice as much damage as the Repulsor Executioner.
Yeah, and the Executioner, okay, it's heavy, so you're gonna hit again. You park it, you're hitting on 2s. Strength 16, you're gonna wound most vehicles on 3. So you're very likely to land 2 shots. AP -4 means most things aren't even most vehicles are not going to get saves, or are going to save on a 6 at the very best if they don't have an invuln. That's pretty much guaranteed 2d6 plus 8 damage. Again, that will, you can kill another Executioner with an Executioner.
Yes.
You cannot kill in 1 shot of, in 1 round of shooting a hammerhead with a hammerhead. You just can't. And even though it has fewer wounds, it has lower toughness because it's T10. I guess that would be the one difference, is that you are more likely to wound with a hammerhead against a hammerhead because you're going to wound on 2s. It's right. Just it's weird. The balancing of shots, and granted, there's other factors to take into account. Tau can guide things, but then that introduces additional weirdness that if I have my hammerhead, I don't only 1 gun is going to be good against vehicles, but if I split my fire, the weapons that aren't guide, I'm going to guide at the vehicle that I'm shooting at, and everything else is going to take a ballistic skill penalty. That's not great either. So there's just weirdness there as far as dealing with it, and that is the best we've got. Actually, no, I take that back. The Storm Surge has a strength 24 gun option.
Oh, gosh.
And I will give it this. Okay. It is heavy, so if it stands still, it's hitting on 3s instead of 4s. It is strength 24. It is AP -6, does 12 damage, and has 2 shots. A Storm Surge can theoretically kill another Storm Surge. I'll give it that, because Storm Surge has 20 wounds. 2-up save doesn't matter against AP 6, but you do have a 4-up invulnerable, so you've got a chance to survive it. The downside is to get that strength 24, you have to be within 24 inches.
You can do it. It has movement, right?
It does have movement, but now you're hitting on 4s instead of 3s because those are heavy weapons.
Just invite people to come close.
And again, because the Storm Surge is made of gun and all the guns are built for killing different things, you don't want to guide a Storm Surge. So you're never going to be hitting... You're unlikely to be hitting better than on 3s by standing still, because it's just not a good choice to guide it because of the Tau rules. But yeah, it's just like things like that. And otherwise, beyond that, a lot of the rail guns and like the Storm Surge, which are like the Storm Surge is a 400-point model. You do not take that casually. You build a list around it. Other than that, you've got like broadside rail guns, which are only strength 12. And you have lots of you used to have lots of options, because back when you could customize crisis suits, now you have one crisis unit that has fusion blasters, and at least it can reroll wounds and damage against monsters or vehicles. That's the one thing it's got. It's still hitting on 4s, and you still have to get within 12 inches to hit something with it. And it's still only strength 9, but at least you're rerolling to wound, so you're still only wounding on 5s most of the time with rerolls. So it's fine. It's one of the best options we have. I'll take it. It's not great, but I'll take it.
Yeah, and then talking about thinking about vehicle usage, you either want your vehicles to take out the opponent's vehicles because you want to have your big things take out their big things, or there's a lot of vehicles that have the indirect fire, and that's where you're going to get that from. So you can either have that or blast or both to try and take out the hordes of Gribblies coming your way.
Which, as point values are dropping for a lot of armies, hordes are getting more and more common. Yeah.
Yes.
So yeah, weaponry is kind of an interesting thing, and I put the question up to our Discord, and you're kind of like saying, "Hey, we're going to be talking about vehicles. What do you like? What do you not like about vehicles?" And one person did mention like they like not having armor values or facings because it's simpler to run them. No, don't have to worry about like your guns are facing the wrong direction, so you can't shoot it. But they also mentioned that smaller games like Combat Patrol, one of the reasons the Combat Patrols now don't really include vehicles is because they're not balanced for a game size that small. Most units that are other units that are included in a Combat Patrol don't have the means to deal with a vehicle effectively.
I mean, even in 1,000-point games, vehicles and I'll say monsters are difficult to deal with. It's 2,000 when you can actually have enough points to get the variety of being able to deal with the vehicles, because at 1,000 points you're running almost at least half your army is vehicles just to deal with the other person's vehicles or monsters. And that goes into with Combat Patrol of, having one vehicle and 500 points is too much. So yeah, I think vehicles only really make sense at the bigger games.
Mm-hmm. But then that also puts some armies at a distinct disadvantage, like Imperial Knights and Chaos Knights. If they can play at 1,000 points. They tend to be Armature or War Dog heavy. That's not a fun game to be on the other side of.
That leans into the only way to deal with it is you have to run vehicle heavy then. Mm-hmm. So, and then you're just playing vehicles. You might not be playing the style of game you want to play.
Yeah. And they also pointed out that some of your best anti-vehicle weaponry is on vehicles. So yeah, it does lead to an arms race where you have to have, because like infantry, with a few exceptions, just doesn't carry anything that strong. And we talked about how like Thunderhammers, like a squad of Thunderhammer Terminators were one of the scariest things you could deal with. and now a squad of Thunderhammer Terminators. Let's see.
I'm going to say they're still not that scary.
No, they're not.
I mean, even if they were the old version, because the problem with Thunderhammers is you have to get in a melee to use them, and most vehicles will just kind of stay out of your charge range.
Yeah, and Terminators are slow.
They are slow, which is
so it's easy to stay out of the range.
Yeah, which is something that changed in this edition. Like they slowed Terminators down as a balancing measure. And it makes sense, they should move a little bit slower than somebody in a more, a lighter, more agile power suit. So yeah, Thunderhammer does do devastating wounds. That's cool. But hits on 4s, it is strength 8, so it will wound most vehicles on 5s. Now granted, half your wounds are going to be devastating, but like strength 8, AP 2 damage each, hitting on 4s, that's not great.
I mean, to me, Thunderhammers are in the same spot Melta-Guns are in. And you're going to say that's not great.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, what it means, like, for Thunderhammers, I'd say the role has changed from being an anti-vehicle weapon to being an anti-elite infantry. Like, you would use Thunderhammers against, like, other Terminator-sized threats.
Yeah, I do kind of wish they did 3 damage or were strength 10 or something to where they would be scary against both. But I think Games Workshop really wants you to focus on vehicles, taking out vehicles.
Mm-hmm. Now, on the other hand, the Chain Fist, which is available on the regular Terminator squad, anti-vehicle 3+. Still strength 8, AP -2 damage, same as a Thunderhammer, but instead of doing devastating wounds, it is made to wound vehicles. It doesn't care how tough your vehicle is, it's wounding you on a 3+.
And I still have my complaint about that.
No.
Because it's only anti-vehicle.
Well, right.
I can't open up a Tyranid like that.
No.
Or I guess a Storm Surge, because the Storm Surge is a monster, right?
No, Storm Surge is a vehicle.
Oh, it was the Riptide that was the monster.
Nope, it's also still it's a vehicle. That is one thing that did.
Okay.
Yeah, in the Tau Codex, all the suits that aren't other than like stealth suits, because they're like definitely infantry sized, all the suits are now vehicles. And the reason they did that was because in 9th edition, they basically had to give like crisis suits their own version of Big Guns Never Tire, because like, well, they're not vehicles, they're battle suits. But we want them to act like vehicle. They want to move like infantry, but act like vehicles when it comes to shooting. And so they're like, you know what? We're just going to simplify the process, and we're going to make them act just like vehicles by making them vehicles. So they are one of the softest vehicles in the game at T5 and like 4 wounds.
They could just do a keyword for, say, like jump packs or jetpack, and like have the rules go off of that.
They already have a battle suit. They have a battle suit keyword. That's all they need.
Well, I'm just saying, I don't know that GW has ever like thought of that, of like ever like just creating a unit type for those specifically. That seems like it would solve the problem.
I know you know that. For our listeners,
I know he's being sarcastic.
I know he's For our listeners who may not be aware, if you go back, I think it was 4th edition included this, but 5th edition definitely.
Yeah, all the way up until the 8th edition reboot.
Right. There was a unit type called jump, or like I think Tau was jetpack. There was also jump pack, because there was jump. And there was jetpack, and jetpack was a form of jump infantry that acted differently. Because jetpacks are what gave us the classic Tau jump, shoot, jump rule, where you could move 6 inches in the charge phase, or in this case, the assault phase, without actually assaulting somebody, and your weapons were relentless, which means you could move and fire without any penalty. So, we used to have these rules, and then, like, 8th edition was such a massive simplification, and then 10th edition is strangely enough, even though we've gone simplified but not simple, 10th edition is slightly more complex than 8th edition. Yeah. It's just 9th edition the complexity was so loaded into the codexes, it got ridiculous. I do like the codex design in 10th edition better, but I think some of the unit designs are weird, and I think vehicles I think it's one of those points where, are they working? Yeah, vehicles work well enough, but I still don't think they have the balance on everything dialed in quite right. There's some vehicles you barely ever see because they are too fragile. They don't have the weapon, the weaponry value to matter, and they don't have special rules that really help. There's usually better choices at a similar price point, or maybe slightly more expensive but better. And granted, that's always going to be the case. As you said, Dennis, the Space Marine Codex has tons of vehicles you will never see on the table because there's just a few much better options at a similar price point. And again, the Melta, the biggest question we got from several people is, why is Melta useless? Why is Melta so useless? And granted, we've been on the Melta is useless beat for a while. I think since the edition dropped, we pretty much were like, yeah, Melta guns suck now. And
I mean, I don't feel as bad about it right now for one reason, and that reason is Bringers of Flame make them feel normal.
But that's sure. But you have to take one I'll say two detachments because salamanders get the same thing. But 2 detachments out of 2 armies are not enough to make vehicles to provide a solid counterpoint to vehicle strength.
I mean, that's true.
Even at strength 10, when you're close enough, because you have to be within 12 inches to get that extra strength, which isn't too bad because a lot of times you're going to want to be there anyway with Melta guns. You have to be there with regular Melta guns, and multi-Meltas, you want to be within that range anyway because that's going to get you close to your Melta damage bonus. So that helps a bit, and it is, I think it's a more graceful fix than I know in the past we've talked about give them all anti-monster, anti-vehicle, but just being +1 strength would be sufficient. If Melta guns across the board were strength 10, I don't think there'd be that many complaints about them because 10 would help against a lot of vehicles.
I mean, the only people that might complain is Meltas could then wound Terminators on 2-up, but so
they kind of should. They all
right.
Melta guns back in the day used to instant death Terminators. Of course, that was also when Terminators had 1 wound anyway.
I mean, I think that's an elegant solution, but I mean, going back to vehicles themselves, Melta's the thing, but there's still, like you said, Laz. There's other ways to deal with the vehicles, but the downside, like you said, is the best way is get another vehicle.
Now on the flip side, one thing that older vehicle rules had was weapons didn't you couldn't auto pen a vehicle if you rolled a 6. It didn't matter if I'm firing a strength 3 las gun at a tank in 3rd through 7th edition, it doesn't matter how many las guns I throw at that tank. They're not going to do anything because they literally cannot even glance the armor. And that is something that changed in 8th edition, where you could just wait to fire a vehicle down. Because you could just because it did have that unified rule set, and because it was just a bucket of tough wounds, well, I can, I throw enough dice at it, I'm going to roll enough 6s, and you're going to mathematically fail saves, and I can chip your vehicle down.
Yeah, this is when we got into the addition of way to fire.
Right.
Yeah, I think people math hammered it out and taking a Warlord Titan at 3,000 points and 3,000 equivalent points of guardsmen with las guns, they would ping it to death in a turn and a half.
Yeah, it's they'll ping it to death before it will be able to kill all of them.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think is that a bug or a feature? Have we decided on should you be able to ping a vehicle to death like that?
both?
Yeah. I think normal vehicles, yes. Like, there should be some element of, the for lack of a better example, like the Saving Private Ryan moment where, he shoots, is shooting the tank with his pistol. And, granted, in that case, I guess they dropped a bomb on it. But, like, right. lucky shots and things like that still happen. Like, I guess Indiana Jones, where it's like they shoot a pistol and it, like, pings around inside there and hits the pilot, and, like, then the tank, stops because
to one side.
Yeah. Like, so I like stuff like that. And I like I guess ultimately I like not feeling like you've wasted points and you can't do anything. Mm-hmm. And that's why I always disliked the older vehicle rules, because you could get pinged and then you're not doing anything for a turn or 2 turns or 3 turns. If you got immobilized or you got, our crew shaken, like, you just couldn't do anything. And it's like, okay, I have this model, but it's not doing anything. On the flip side of that, not being able to, like, somebody puts a Land Raider on the table and, like, well, I brought nothing to touch this, so it's just going to get free reign. Like, I do like the ability, the balancing factor of having maybe not every weapon, but maybe, I don't know, maybe weapons that are half strength of the toughness can wound on 6s. So there's at least, like, some element to it, where, like, I'm probably not gonna, a cultist with a stubber's probably not gonna wreck a Land Raider eventually, but, like, maybe a bolt gun, could do some damage to it. I don't know. There's probably some way to make some balance there.
I'll say no, because bolt guns are only strength 4, and there's really not many vehicles that are toughness 8.
Sure. Yeah, and like I said, I don't know if that's necessarily the answer. That's just kind of spitballing at this point. But, maybe there's some relationship that you can set there and say, like, okay, anything with a certain strength level, minimum strength of whatever, can potentially wound on a 6 or something. And then, like, on the flip side, like, super heavies, and again, it's kind of interesting because, like, knights are super heavies technically, but, knights are kind of good a little bit, but, like, something like a... Titans or whatever are unplayable, and granted 40k, so maybe they should be, but, like, are kind of unplayable because you bring, like, a Warhound Titan or something like that, and you'll just get shot to death by bolters, because you just don't have enough wounds. So I don't know. I kind of go back and forth on it. I think there are certain vehicles that probably should be immune to that, but I do like it as an ability to at least feel like you've got some options.
Well, I think they do that because you don't want to, like in this case, you used guards versus knights. Guards without their vehicles wouldn't be able to do anything with knights, so they have to balance it some way, and that way is maybe just letting you ping it.
So maybe the other thing I was thinking of that I'm just kind of spitballing here again is maybe you put a universal strat out there that's like, okay, you spend a point on this unit, and you all of a sudden can, wound a vehicle on a 5 or a 6 or something. Like for example, I'm going to spend this strat on this unit of guardsmen, and they have anti-vehicle 5 up for a turn. Something like that. So you at least there's some ability to do something, but it's still a resource allocation thing, and you're not able to just, overwhelm things with weight of fire.
Yeah, because I'm kind of 2 minds about it, because I don't like that weight of fire. I mean, 8th edition was definitely the edition where weight of fire really became a thing, and it was always good, like, infantry against infantry, but, like, where weight of fire could wear away anything, I do feel like it was a mistake. I do feel like it made vehicles feel less vehicle-y, and monsters as well. Like, it made, like, it got rid of that moment, like, oh crap, we need, we're a whole bunch of guardsmen with las guns, and a Carnifex charges in. Yeah, you're boned. Like, that's just not your day at that point. Yeah. And it does.
I saw a Space Marine video game. They did fine.
Yeah. But yeah, it's like, you don't want somebody to feel bad for picking a particular army and just like, you don't want a matchup to feel like rock, paper, scissors necessarily, which Weight of Fire does help with that. But at the same time, it does it makes vehicles feel less special. And again, it just makes them feel like a pile of tough wounds. And I think as someone coming from older editions and looking at vehicles, I think that's kind of where my issue with it all kind of falls in. And while vehicles feel a little bit better, and like the pivot rules that they added, as kind of weirdly implemented as they were, and like a sudden kind of ham-fisted change is what it felt like, it did actually start making vehicles feel like they play different again, because like lining up charges with vehicles, now you lose a little bit of movement if you are pivoting around a building, or it makes moving them and like, I need to move around this, or like I need to pivot, like I'm going to pivot to try to get on that objective or something like that. It makes that matter, and that makes vehicles feel like vehicles again. And because most monsters are on round bases, they don't have those similar penalties, but the larger ones that are on oblong bases do, which makes sense. They're bigger, they're more cumbersome. I want the rules to be simple, but I also want the units to feel like the way they should in the narrative that we're telling on the tabletop. And one of the ways you can do that is to give them just a few slightly different rules, and more ways to handle them, but more ways for them to be cool too. And having a vehicle worn down by las gun fired, like las cannon, yes, las gun, no. Like that's like, I want people to like, maybe you do need to take a mixed arms, army to properly deal with somebody else bringing a vehicle. But then at the same time, you have, again, armies like Chaos Knights or Imperial Knights, where it's like, well, they can bring is vehicles, unless they're like Chaos and they ally in some demons, or they're Imperial Knights and they ally in some agents of the Imperium. And I also feel like, in all honesty, for most play, knight armies are a mistake. I hate to say it. I know there are people, some of the people in our, like one of the guys in our group, who is a great guy, very friendly, very kind. I always have good games with him, and knights are like Chaos Knights are his army of choice. I love playing him because he's fun to play against. I hate playing him because it's always dealing with knights in an edition where war dogs are a nightmare to deal with. They are so badly balanced.
Yeah.
And it's like, if you didn't have armies like that, where you had to allow any army to have tools to deal with it, I think it would be easy to implement some of the changes that would make vehicles feel a little bit more special, as long as you also applied things like, hey, let's shush up melt-a-guns a little bit to make them better at killing armor.
Well, here's an idea. Why don't we roll knights into this like Imperial Codex, where they can like help out some agent thingies? And
well, I mean, they're kind of that way already, because you can ally them in,
splash them in anywhere.
Yeah. But like, for example, the guy I play with, Derek from our local group at Pulp Fiction, he brings, like, when he brings his war dogs, like, he's got stalkers, executioners, huntsmen, carnivores, brigands, he's taken all of them. And the ones I have the most trouble dealing with are like the carnivores and brigands, because I mean, all of them are tough 10. They're fast because they move 12. They've got their OC8, which means they can take an objective from you very easily, and it's hard to shift them off of it. T10, which a lot of my weaponry, like I was playing Tau, a lot of my weaponry caps out at 9. So I'm wounding him on 5s. And at one point in our most recent game, he realized, like, I had asked him the toughness just as a refresher, and he had in his mind crossed the wounds and the toughness, and he gave me T12. And then like the next round, he's like, oh no, wait, did I say 12? I meant to say 10. And he felt so bad because like he rolled me in that game. And he felt so bad about that like verbal typo that he's like, I should take the win. Like I should take a loss on this one because I gave you the wrong stat. And I had to keep reminding him, dude, my weaponry maxes, except for like the 2 railgun broadsides, my weaponry maxes out at 9. I'm wounding you on 5s either way. It didn't make a difference. I mean, like he felt bad about that, but it didn't matter. That's like the worst part. It's like he gave me the wrong number, and even with the right number, it didn't matter. And because the Brigand and Carnivore are dedicated, like one is the Brigand is dedicated shooting, the Carnivore is dedicated assault. They hit on 2s.
Yeah.
And like the Brigand, if it's shooting at the closest target, the AP on the weapons all goes up by 1. Carnivore can reroll charge rolls, and
they're just strong.
Yeah, and
very,
it's
very
just like,
strong.
They're very strong, and it's like it's not a fun army to play against. It is, and it's. I mean, if you're playing Pariah Nexus matched play where you've got objectives and you can kind of play around with like the secondary objectives and try to outpoint them, but even that can be tricky because they can flood the board with like a dozen of these things, which have a decently large footprint but small enough to hide. They're fast, they're deadly, and
so how much of this though is like, and I'm just asking this, like I'm not trying to counterpoint you or anything, how much of that is the fact that they're vehicles versus the fact that they might just be like horribly undercosted? Like, you know, is there other things that we could do to balance that? Like, are they good because they're vehicles, or are they good because they're just not balanced correctly?
Well, in this case, the vehicle part for the Brigands, the vehicle part kicks in with like big guns never tire. If they were monsters, it would be the same issue. So it's not specifically that they are vehicles, but again, vehicles only are slightly special in modern editions anyway, but they are vehicles in the sense of, I'm kind of classing them as vehicles. They are statted as vehicles. Not just that they have the vehicle keyword, but they have the toughness, the wounds, the armor save of vehicles. They carry the weapon loadout of vehicles.
But a lot of them have better weapon skill and ballistic skill than other vehicles, as you said.
Yeah.
And the other part of it is they have a lot more movement than other vehicles.
Mm-hmm.
Well, so the thing that was kind of the reason why I kind of asked that, because I'm thinking about, like you mentioned earlier with the Tau, you know, all of the Tau suits basically became vehicles. Maybe that is GW moving away from the fact that, okay, it's okay to have a tough 5 vehicle, finger quotes, or a tough 7 or tough. So maybe the answer is we lower their toughness. You know, they become,
Honestly, at T9, War Dogs would become much easier to deal with. There's suddenly, you open up a whole range of weapons that can start wounding them on 4s.
Yeah.
Or even that are wounding them on 5s instead of 6s. Because at T10, Heavy Bolter wounds them on 6s. A lot of weaponry, like, at T9, Heavy Bolters wound them on 5s. Melt-A-Guns wound them on 4s. It's like when they scaled up, when they increased the toughness scale beyond what we had in 8th and 9th edition, a few weapons, like some weapons did get, the high end of weapons got shifted.
Yeah.
But I don't think enough of them did. I think the toughness outpaced the weapon strength. And I'm wondering if that was part of this is a more resilient edition. Units live longer in this edition. And that is not entirely true. Infantry does not. Infantry dies in droves in this edition. Vehicles last longer in this edition. And I think therein lies the issue, is vehicles, I think, either scaled up toughness a little bit too far, or a lot of the weaponry, apart from like a few spot items, like those really ridiculously strong weapons, like didn't scale up quite the same way, but it makes it harder to have the right tools in your toolbox to deal with a vehicle-heavy army because of the stat line. And again, I do agree that if these vehicles if they had the monster keyword instead of vehicle, like they would be about the same, except that Dennis's anti-vehicle weapon would be even less useful against them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I'll say to your point on whether it's the vehicles or the weapons, I'm going to say it's the weapons because the increase in toughness for vehicles also allowed them to add extra toughness for infantry. Since there are some tough 6 infantry out there, which are kind of hard to deal with too. But it gives you that granularity by extending the vehicles higher that you can do that, but we go back to where we were at the beginning of the edition of, do we have enough tools to deal with the increased toughness of vehicles? Because right now, as we went through the history, the biggest 2 things would either be like the las cannons, Bright Lance type things, or Melta. And currently, in this edition, it's only one of those 2 can really deal with them.
Mm-hmm. And as far as the most recent points level on, like, again, for, like, let's say Chaos Knights in particular, the Brigand, the Huntsman, and the Stalker just got cheaper. The Brigand's 165 points for a vehicle that has a very nasty anti-vehicle weapon, which is a melt-a-gun. I will point out, it is a melted weapon, but it also has strength 12. It has a 24-inch range, strength 12, AP -4, D6 damage, melt of 4. That thing gets close, it will ruin your day. And 2 shots. Yeah. Again, a brigand could destroy another brigand, assuming that it fails its invulnerable saves. It'll wound it on 3s. It's AP -4, so it doesn't get a save apart from its invulnerable. And with 2 shots, hitting on 2s, wounding on 3s, it will do and if you are within 12 inches, it's doing 2d6 plus 8 damage. And it only has 12 wounds. So, yeah, it's like, it's not like that's the other thing, is the brigands have better anti-vehicle weaponry than I can bring to use against them. Because also brigands are battle line. You could have 6 of them if you wanted.
Right.
Well, you gotta have as many as you can to take out the other knights.
Mm-hmm. Oh, and the carnivore, if it gets into close combat with a vehicle, 6 attacks, hitting on 2s, strength 12, so hitting on 2s, wounding a lot of vehicles on 3s.
See, I don't see any problem with that.
AP -3, so very, like, saves. You're going to save on 6s with a lot of vehicles, because most vehicles are like 3-up saves. D6 plus 2 damage each.
Yeah, I don't have a problem with that. Melee should be better in this edition.
Well, maybe we should, like, tone its weapons down and make them on par with the, like, Thunderhammers.
But then at the same time, you're not giving anything up with that, because the carnivore has the option. It has a Reaper chain talon, so it's got the chain sword on it that can do a sweep strike. So if you don't want to go after a vehicle and you want to go after infantry, well, it's got 12 attacks hitting on 2s at strength 8, so it's going to wound most infantry on 2s.
Nope, just change its arms to 2 Thunderhammers.
Hell yeah.
So we're going to go the old Hellbrute route and give it a Thunderhammer, a weapon which I don't think anyone takes for.
Nope. No. And there's a reason.
There's totally a reason. It's terrible. But yeah, it's just like, again, it's one of these cases where you have an army, like in this case, it's an army of vehicles that are equipped to handle other vehicles better than many vehicles are equipped to handle them, and better than many armies can, like, again, and yes, the trade-off is you have 12 models. Or you have 10 to 12 models. You can, maybe you take 10 and you splash in some demons to deep strike in to get on objectives for you.
Right, and I think that was a deterrent in previous editions before all the armatures came into play, because when you only had 3 to 5 knights, yeah, sure, you could table your opponent easier that they could harm you, but at least they had the OC, they had the movement, they could take care of objectives better than you could. Now with armigers being a thing as like cheap, very strong vehicles, they can flood the board with them, so they've got as many units as you do that are tougher than yours if you're doing infantry at all. And your one advantage of having infantry was you had more units and you could flood the board. Now that advantage is gone, it kind of shifts it into the opponent's favor then.
Yeah. And so, like, when you have a case like this, I can totally see the value in being able to throw a ton of lasgun shots at things like this and hoping something sticks, because you won't have unless you take more dedicated anti-vehicle stuff, you don't have a lot of other options, and you need anything that you can get tool-wise to deal with this. So I'd say like this, like armies like this, and it's funny that like Imperial Knights don't run the same way. You don't see that many Imperial Knight armies that are oops all armigers, the way you have oops all war dogs for the Chaos Knights. And partially that's because Imperial Knights don't have an equivalent of the Carnivore or the Brigand. They don't have any vehicles that hit on twos.
Yep.
They don't have specialized, like they have like the Helverin, which there is an equivalent of it in the Chaos Knights. It's good. It's very good. It's got a very nasty autocannon, but it still only hits on 3s and is still only strength 9. It's better at killing like very light vehicles or infantry or crisis suits. I hate to say, but it's true, because they do 3 damage apiece with 4 shots per autocannon. So yeah, it's like, but that's something that both sides have. But like, I think Chaos Knights are a case where it's like, you can see why people do this, because that is the best option and it's good at handling everything. Now, their win rates don't necessarily reflect that, and I think that is one of the reasons they haven't been, if anything, they've gotten points drops, because the rest of the army rules aren't great, and you can play around it in competitive play. So I don't want to say like, oh, well, this army is broken, it's the best ever, because obviously it's not. But I think it is an army that kind of like highlights, like it throws the like a spotlight on, this is a case of the issues with vehicles. And if you can adjust this army, I think, or adjust other armies to better deal with armies like this, just outside of competitive play, just in standard play, because I feel like this is one of those armies that it's a gatekeeper army. Mm-hmm. And we've had gatekeeper armies before. Custodes were gatekeeper army. We've had Grey Knights as a gatekeeper army. We've had all sorts of armies as gatekeeper armies. Like, if you can't deal with these weird corner cases, you're not going to be able to proceed in a tournament. But not every game is a tournament, and these armies are all, like, an army like this is also a little bit weirdly balanced, even in casual play. Especially in casual play, because in a casual play, you're more likely to bring a list that is just like, well, this is the list I want to bring because it's cool, rather than this is the list I'm going to bring because it is properly balanced to deal with the wide range of targets. And I wish I could say it would be as simple as fixing melted guns, and I don't think it is. I think there's a lot of fine adjustments that probably could stand to be made, and also just I think some of those adjustments would have to be just adjusting things so that more armies have more consistent even if they do have to bring vehicles to do it, because that used to be, back in the day, the way you dealt with vehicles is you brought vehicles of your own.
Yeah, because otherwise you couldn't even damage them.
Mm-hmm.
And if you couldn't even stun lock them, then there was no point in even shooting them. So yeah.
And the reason I'm like highlighting Chaos Knights especially is because it is one of those like weird skew armies where they don't have the option to take a mixed arm. Like, the best they can do is mixed arms, as in, well, this armature has these 2 arms, and this armature has these 2 arms, and this armature has these 2 arms. That's what makes them different. But because of the lack of a fully fleshed out ally system, or because of a lack of flexibility and units that can be taken in their army or whatever. It's like, it's when you hit armies that are all vehicles, and it can be very difficult. And he's also played an army, a variation of this at like 1,000 points, and it's not any easier to deal with there for sure.
No, see my point earlier, where if you're facing an all vehicle or all monster list, you have to have at least half of your army dedicated to killing vehicles. Mm-hmm. And normally that's like I said, that's what I had to do with the Tyranids. I took 3 vehicles. It made the Tyranid fights simple then, but I felt bad because that's not the style of game I was going for.
Right. But if we check like the most recent Meta Monday, which was from this past weekend, right now, strangely enough, Mechanicus is at 59% win rate for the weekend. But like Chaos Knights are down to 44%. So it's like, obviously, in general, it's not that big an issue. Imperial Knights are at 45%. So at a competitive standpoint, obviously this is not a problem.
Well, and I think that's because people have adjusted for the edition, and they're taking more vehicles to be able to deal with everybody else's vehicles.
Right. It's like, obviously the holistic balance of the game as far as this situation is considered is not bad. So I don't want to say like vehicles have broken I'm not making that argument. Vehicles have not broken 40k. You can play a totally fine game, and as with vehicles being around, looking at the armies that are doing well, Mechanicus has a number of decent anti-vehicle weapons. Gene Stealer Cults is kind of an odd one, but I think they're playing more on the objectives rather than going for straight up kills necessarily. Astra Militarum, Guard, especially now that tank commanders can give themselves orders. Those are going to be pretty solid. Blood Angels have just been very good. Chaos Space Marines are still winning with Chaos Cult. That's the one that really throws me. Chaos Cult is like the one that we were sure was going to was terrible. They still can't fix that because apparently flooding the board with a bunch of cheap cultists still wins games. Meanwhile, Tao's at a solid 50%. So, maybe I just need to get good. I don't know.
There's also a total different thing, as we've been saying in previous ones, of crusade narrative versus competitive play.
Right. And like the missions we're playing right now in our league, I'm actually using I think I mentioned it an episode or two ago, we're using bunker missions from White Dwarf. Like I've put together a series of missions to tell the narrative that we are telling with the story while we're using an urban conquest map to track how the various teams are doing. And so everybody's playing the same mission every week, but those missions don't have like secondary objectives or anything like that. They just have they usually have a little bit of progressive scoring and maybe an end of game scoring as well. And it's fine. The games play fine, but it's like the most recent one we did, there are 4 objectives and they're all in no man's land. And actually one of the players was like, so what about so where are the other 2 objectives? I said, there's not 2 other objectives. These are the ones on the table. Well, what about secondary objectives? Nope, no secondary objectives. You're not using the deck at all. You're just playing what's on the mission sheet. And I'm curious to see how that has adjusted how people are playing the game. But I would feel like it's a very different beast than, what's like Pariah Nexus play. So maybe vehicles, it's okay. Maybe it's okay if vehicles are a bit overbalanced in this edition. As much as the Melta thing feels weird, and I still think that one needs to be adjusted somewhat. Mm-hmm. Maybe it's fine. Maybe it is fine. I just also happen to find that Pariah Nexus games take longer. They're definitely taking longer than our bunker missions, just because of all the extra tracking that has to be done with points and drawing new objectives and deciding, okay, I'm going to spend a command point on this one and ditch it, or we'll ditch it at the end of the turn to get a command point. There's a lot more decision making that has to be done, as opposed to having here's 4 objectives and here's what the mission says you got to do with them.
Yeah, and that's, I think, I haven't actually played the Pariah Nexus tournament missions, because we've just been doing book missions from the Pariah Nexus or the Leviathan, and I get what you're saying there, because you don't have the moving targets for what you need to do. It's kind of fixed. So yeah, I didn't think about having the moving targets of drawing your cards and slowing the game down, but I guess it could.
It does a little. Like, I think, and again, if you're using a chess clock and tracking time and making sure that you're doing everything in as timely fashion as you can get through a game. It'll be close, but you can get through it. But it's just we're getting a little off topic here, but just but I mean, it's also one of the reasons why I think a knight army can do a little bit better, because they don't have as many moving pieces to deal with. But at the same time, they probably have a harder time with dealing with like the flexible objectives, like where suddenly where they need to be changes from where they've been moving towards this whole time. So that can definitely have an effect on the game. And so maybe that's where they're falling down a little bit, is they're not as good at scoring those objectives. So from a competitive standpoint, and I'm curious how much that changes the calculus on where Games Workshop decides to balance things. I mean, we're almost a year and a half into 10th edition, and I kind of have the feeling that if they haven't adjusted vehicles by now, and I think I mean, technically you could count the Pivot edition as a vehicle adjustment, because those are the units that affected the most. If they haven't adjusted them by now, then this is likely kind of where they want them to be, I would guess. Like, I've seen people saying, like some of our local people are like, oh yeah, I like playing because they've started up an Age of Sigmar group, and like, oh, yeah, I like playing Age of Sigmar because I don't have to deal with like all the vehicles. There's like you'll have a few monsters and then a bunch of infantry, and so it's a very different environment. And so I don't know if they're just liking that because it's simpler to deal with. I don't know. I get mixed data from people who are not terribly fond of dealing with vehicles. You've got a meta that seems to like vehicles, but they're also lowering the points to make armies feel more horde-like. But the strong vehicle armies aren't necessarily tearing up the charts the way they were. Although, like, the main winning army for Blood Angels was the Ironstorm Spearhead. So Blood Angels, but they're playing with vehicles. So
Ironstorm Spearhead's amazing.
Ironstorm Spearhead is very, very strong, which then leads into maybe vehicles, or maybe like stacking things on top of making the vehicles good is too good.
I could see that.
But like Soulforged Warp Pack for Chaos Space Marines is not doing well at all, and that was like the Demon Engine vehicle army. Nobody's even taking the Iron Warriors detachment. Yeah, so I don't know. Space Marines, they're getting their most wins off of an Ironstorm Spearhead. So yeah, like you can see the armies where obviously having strong vehicles and finding ways to make them stronger is working. But it's also got to, at least competitively, it also has to be paired with having objective holders. And I think that's where like the Knights armies are kind of falling apart. So yeah, I as much as the balance seems weird to me, maybe it's not. So maybe this whole thing, like maybe I still think vehicles need some adjustment, but maybe not that much. I don't know.
No, I think you made a good point about like being long enough in here that if they haven't made some adjustments in this direction yet, they probably aren't. I think, this was one of the big selling points for this edition was the changes to the vehicles, and I think they're happy with it. I think it's just, maybe it's just a thing that in a future edition they may address or something like that, and they may tone it down or change it, or we just have to kind of reframe it ourselves, and stop, and not necessarily like stop thinking about it the way we used to, but like just think about it in the game's terms rather than like, this is what it was like in 5th edition.
Yeah, no, you're right. It's like we have talked in past episodes when like we've had edition changes, especially when it's been big edition changes like 7th to 8th. One of the big things we said from 7th to 8th was you've got to unlearn the edition and and learn this new one. And I think part of me is still carrying around little bits of that baggage. Like this, the feel in some cases doesn't feel right, but maybe I'm just basing it more off of the feel of what I remember from past editions, which were not perfect by any means. They had all sorts of weird issues then too. Like, I do think there's some things that have been mistakes, and they've been mostly tied to vehicles. Like flyers, I do think were a mistake.
Mm-hmm.
I think super heavies in the core game were maybe not the best choice, and I think as cool as knights are, and as someone who owns several knights, I still question whether they should have been their own standalone faction ever outside of like Apocalypse. Because I do think that I think that's the biggest issue, is it does skew things, and so they have to take any sort of balancing they do, they have to take those factions into account, which may throw everything off for the armies that can't lean into it as much. So I would say that would be the most. But again, because of that, like, this is where they are not going to drop those two factions out of the game right now for balance purposes.
Factions, no, but they're kind of already writing flyers out.
They pretty much are. Like, flyers are just kind of I think that flyers, they've all but admitted at this point that they can't get flyers right. That there's no good way to balance flyers, especially as the table size has shrunk. It's can't have gotten any better. So
sure there is. Have them call an airstrike with a command point, and then you have your flyer like on the side. You say pew 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 pew.
So basically, they'll be Tau drones, only much larger.
I mean,
yes,
honestly,
and not on the table.
I think there's a way for them in universe to explain it. All of the Tyranids came in and ate all of the flyers.
Right.
We have squatted the flyers.
That just means they'll be back in 10 years.
By Tyranids. Yeah.
Right.
There's a big Tyranid that ate all those Thunderhawks.
And because they're so familiar with the process of being squatted, that's why the Votann have not built any flyers.
Man, going off topic, I sure hope the Votann get like a super heavy or some other vehicles that are cool. Because, I mean, right now we've got a transport and a tank or a Land Raider. So it would be good to see more Votann vehicles, even though they've got the two base things are covered. Because I guess I'm going back to vehicles. All you really need for an army to have like the core vehicles is you need a transport, unless you're knights, and you need a vehicle.
Yeah, let's
destroyer.
take knights out of the equation. Knights do not fit anybody else. So.
Yeah. Right. I mean, those are the only two vehicles an army really needs. Is you need a tank and a transport, at base level.
Yeah. No, I mean, and depending on what, like a lot of the armies, they're the same chassis. Or something very similar. Like for the longest time, it's like except for Land Raiders, all the Space Marine vehicles, other than like land speeders, like the really light little skimmer ones, everything was built on the Rhino chassis. So they were all, they all were the same. All the Tau vehicles were built off of the Hammerhead Devilfish chassis. A lot of the Guard ones were built off the Chimera chassis.
Eldar was built off the Falcon chassis.
Yeah. So I think you're right. It's like if you had something in between the Sagittar and the Land Fortress to be kind of a main battle tank for you, because like even the Sisters have a main battle tank now with the Castigators. Well, even I was gonna say you get some weirdness like the Drukhari, but even the Drukhari have the Ravager, which is basically we took a Raider and slapped 2 more guns on it.
Yep. Yep. And they've got the Venom for the small transport.
Right.
So you've got your small transport, your large transport. You've got, I don't know what you call the Tantalus. I guess the extra large transport.
We call it discontinued.
Stuffs. Yeah. Forge-World stuff doesn't fit.
Yeah. I mean, Mechanicus has a transport and a walking tank, so they're close enough. Gene Stealer cults, I guess you can take Brood Brothers, and then you have everything the Guard can have, so good enough. Yeah, everyone else is pretty much like Chaos Demons are weird, but they're like the opposite of Knights, so they still don't like. This is a game where it's like there's a couple of armies that are just weird outliers for everything else.
Well, and Rob, remember when I had my Slaanesh army and it was doing poorly because it was all infantry and no shooting, or all melee and no shooting? And remember how I fixed it?
You added a knight to it.
Yes,
or you added a knight and some Emperor's Children for shooting.
Yes. When Slaanesh became a faction keyword.
Yep.
That was silly, but it was fun. And it just goes to show that there are melee that need the vehicles and the shooting. But I don't know that we have the other way, where I don't think vehicles need infantry and melee as much as the infantry need the vehicles.
I will also point out the two worst performing armies from the last week, according to Meta Monday, were Imperial Agents and Adeptus Custodes, and those are two armies that are notably bereft of much in the way of vehicles.
Hey, Custodes can take Land Raiders.
They can, and Sisters of Silence
nobody
can
does.
take Rhinos. Yeah, nobody does. And Imperial Agents can theoretically take Chimeras and Rhinos.
I'm going to be weird. I don't count Rhinos as vehicles in the sense that I call them on the transport side because they don't have. I mean, you have a hunter-killer missile. Ooh,
right.
I have one chance to. Yeah. So
yeah,
they don't count for the vehicle that can take out another vehicle.
Right. They don't have and I do think that should be kind of the standard. Is you should have like any given like main battle tank for a force should be able to take out its equivalent in one round of good shooting. I think that's like, that should be, granted that you always have variance there. You will not always hit. You will not always wound. Your opponent can make saves. So it's not a guaranteed, but theoretically any tank that is geared against other vehicles should be able to take out itself in a turn or an equivalent thereof. I mean, obviously you don't want to shoot yourself. That would be bad.
Right. I was wondering why you were putting big red buttons in your vehicles, Rob.
No, that's more of an orc thing. They got to press the big red button. It's not an older edition Vindicator where you have a 12-inch range and the shot scatters onto yourself. And because it's an ordnance weapon, it's got a better damage chart and more likely to blow yourself up. So yeah, maybe in the end, as I'd say, the two things I would come away with, apparently vehicles are where they want them to be in this edition, as much as that may kind of frustrate some of us as far as like things not working the way we kind of picture them in our heads. But the other thing is I think we can all agree that the tools to deal with vehicles still need to be distributed a little bit better, and maybe and a few fine tweaks, but otherwise, yeah, the more I talk about it, it's like, yeah, I think vehicles are, I think they're fine. I think they're fine. We'll see what happens with, I'm curious to see what happens with the December balance stage slate, though, because that,
I'm kind of dreading it.
Because they're gonna do something to Space Marines. So
and
Sisters,
Miracle Dice.
Yeah, I think Miracle Dice are gonna take a hit, and I'm going to be sad because I like the Miracle Dice system.
I'm hoping it's just make it once per phase like the Eldar Fate dice.
That would be my guess.
Because then that doesn't feel like a huge change. So it's workable.
Rather than once per unit per phase.
Right.
And so basically it would continue to be like, so they basically, Eldar preload all their Fate dice. Sisters have to earn theirs, but otherwise they would function very similarly.
Right.
Yeah, we'll see what happens, but I'm more curious to see what they're going to do with Space Marines at present, because they do want to make it a better playing experience, which means I would not be surprised if we see some changes to maybe say the Ironstorm Spearhead, and maybe ways to discourage some of the Divergent chapters from taking that was one of their big selling points for Space Marines, but I think it has not worked out for them quite the way they were hoping.
No, I thought it was the other way around. Is any of the chapters, like the Dark Angels, Blood Angels, if they could take Ironstorm and still be Dark Angels, So I think that is another working as intended thing.
Okay.
Because they didn't want you to be defined by detachments.
Your paint scheme. Yeah.
Right. They just wanted to be, this is who you are. But I think the bigger change for me will be seeing what they do with Death Watch in December.
Yes, that will be big. Hopefully they do it properly. I'm curious to see how they're like, are they going to keep them inside Imperial agents, or are they going to do something where
I think they have to bring him back to Space Marines.
Bring him back into Space Marines, which is, boy, I feel bad for anyone who spent money on an Imperial Agents book. But how many times have we said that about other books? So
because there's a lot more in Imperial Agents than Death Watch.
Yeah. not an army's worth, not a full codex's worth. You're never going to convince me of that.
I will agree with you on that part, but no, I think the only way they could bring because Sisters are in the Sisters Codex, Grey Knights are in the Grey Knights Codex. I would see Death Watch getting kind of reinstated into the Space Marines,
and then just still have them like have the basic kill team and Watchmaster like in. Yeah. The agents could, like, you can splash these in without allying in.
Right.
Yeah, I think they would pretty much.
That's how I'd see it.
Yeah, they'd pretty much have to just make a Xenos Hunters detachment or something for Space Marines.
A Xenos Hunters detachment that isn't just the Death Watch thing for Imperial agents, and change that book slightly too.
I mean, you pretty much have. I mean, it would be the easiest way to drop them in without having to, like, it's Death Watch, so they get this rule and they get other stuff too.
Right.
But yeah, we'll have to see what happens with that. Yeah, so that will obviously be after the Grand Narrative. We don't know when in December that's coming. My guess will be probably early December, after, like, maybe a week or so after the Grand. Or do you think they would take the World Champions into? No, they're supposed to be playtesting this stuff already. They wouldn't change it hopefully they won't change it in the last minute based on World Championship results. So
I don't think so.
Yeah.
I wouldn't be shocked if they actually announce some of the plans at the preview, to be honest with you.
I could see that, because that like let people know it's not going to drop until after the Grand Narrative, so like maybe first week of December, but theoretically, they said they were playtesting it already. Although the people I've talked to, they're like, "Oh yeah, well it's GW playtesting, so who knows what that's worth." I can't argue with that. So yeah, so we'll see what happens, and I'll be curious to see if they change anything with vehicles. Maybe they will do tweaks, or maybe they'll leave. Maybe they are fine with where they are, and they're going to leave them alone. So I think that pretty much wraps up this discussion. I know you guys are pretty much focused on getting everything ready for traveling to Atlanta this week.
Yep.
I have to go and try to repack my bag and make sure nothing breaks after this. So
yeah,
don't worry, Kevin. I will bring clippers and glue for when we have to fix things.
I am not worried about my army.
You are worried about your armor.
Yeah. I don't think I'm bringing big enough glue for that.
Yeah, because I think I don't like. I think you posted this on the Discord. I want to say you posted it.
I posted it on Discord. I posted some sample images up on my Instagram because I want to basically do like actually get somebody else to like take photos of it, like when I'm there in person. But yes, I've got my Chaos Fire Warrior cosplay that Joe from Joe's Prop Shop designed the 3D printed files for me, and then I've been spending the last month, I think, getting everything printed, getting everything painted, glued together, sanded, weathered, all that stuff. So now it barely fits in my bag, so that's why I have to kind of like, because the chest piece is like just wide enough that it'll fit in the suitcase, which might actually be good because it won't rattle around. But I have to kind of take everything out again and reposition some things because I realized there was a couple of things that I didn't include. So
see, this is why you should do something where you could just like I dress up as the Iron Master, so I could just have a coat and belt and goggles. I'm good.
Yeah, all animations got the more of me this time. Because I've been working on that and I haven't finished painting my models yet. So
yeah, 4 days.
All I can say,
done.
Kevin,
I just haven't done it yet.
is that when TSA checks your luggage, you are going to end up on the most interesting watch list.
It's all plastic, so it should be fine. But yeah, it's.
I mean, well, they'll still random inspection. They're going to open that up and find the bloody Cornate stuff in there. Bloody alien looking Cornate stuff. Like I said, you're going to end up on the most interesting of watch lists. We don't know, but something's up with this guy.
Something not right about that kid.
Right.
I mean, that's fine. I'm probably already on those watch lists.
Next episode, I think will basically be your guys' coverage of the grand narrative.
Yes.
Yeah, and if it goes as planned, we'll record each night we're there, so that way you kind of get a feel of the story as it progresses.
Yep. Basically what we did last year, so yeah.
Yeah. It worked, we're doing it again.
I am hoping somebody posts pictures of your cosplay on Warhammer Community. I hope somebody notices.
Oh, that would be cool for Kevin.
Because based on the pictures, it's a really cool costume. So I'm excited to I hope to see it, like pictures of it in the wild. I think that'll be neat. Also, a little bit of an update. If you follow us on Facebook, you may have noticed that I posted the episode 311, our last episode announcement, and that disappeared within a day. Apparently, after a dozen years of posting this, hey, episode blank is available for download, we are now considered spammers for having posted the same thing. We're going to see what happens with this episode. If it doesn't work well, I don't want to say we're necessarily going to drop our Facebook presence, but we may start focusing more on our Blue Sky presence. So we are on Blue Sky. If you are new to that platform, as several million people are this last week, I think they've put on something like a couple of days ago it was 3 million, and I think they've added another million since then. They're at 18 million users now. But if you are on Blue Sky, you can find us at basically Blue Sky Blue Sky app / preferredenemies.com. Just search for Preferred Enemies on Blue Sky. You'll find us. And it's not just us. There's a lot of cool people have started popping up on Blue Sky and making it their social media location of choice. Like pretty much the entire Jugs crew is there. So like Rob Simon, Louise Sugden, Chris Peach have all shown up there. Uncle Adam from Tabletop Minions has said, unless something massively changes on the other site, Blue Sky is going to be his primary social media site. There's a huge hobby community on Blue Sky. So tons of painters that if you're looking for ideas on painting minis, there's some really, really good ones on there. Like Cerberus XT, who's done the pride flag painted not just Marines, all the 40K factions. Yeah. They're on there. There's just a ton of really cool people that have either been on Blue Sky for a while or are now popping up on Blue Sky. So again, I think they're and you can just look for hashtags like Warhammer 40K, Warhammer Community, painting miniatures, stuff like that. Painting Warhammer. You'll even probably find some of my stuff. I've tagged stuff like Painting Warhammer and Warhammer 40K. So yeah, just go to look for Preferred Enemies on Blue Sky. Yeah, Blue Sky, BSKY. It's bsky.app /profile /preferredenemies.com. You'll find us on Blue Sky. There's a link on our website. Unfortunately, it's marked with a cloud, not the butterfly icon, because nobody's added the butterfly icon to their social media plugin yet. But I imagine that will change relatively soon now that there's a ton more people on there. So, But we'll see what happens with the Facebook post. Hopefully the post for this episode will stick. If not, we will let you know what we're going to do. But I think we are getting late, so that wraps up this episode. This episode 312. 313 will be the coverage of the U.S. Grand Narrative in Atlanta. So until then, from all of us here at Preferred Enemies, I'm your host, Rob.
Kevin.
Dennis.
And Richard.
Good night, good gaming, and drive me closer. I want to hit it with my sword.